One quiet afternoon on a small northern street, an elderly woman was sweeping the sidewalk beside her loyal German shepherd. A car came speeding around the corner, nearly hitting her. Inside were a group of wealthy young men from the neighborhood, used to privilege and never being questioned. They stepped out laughing, mocking her clothes, her age, her work. They poured water over her head and even struck the dog that tried to shield her. To them, it was just entertainment, a cruel moment of power on an ordinary day. But they had no idea they were about to pay a very heavy price. Because the woman they humiliated was the mother of a Navy SEAL team commander, a man who understands honor, discipline, and what it truly means to protect family. Stay until the end to see what happened next, and if you believe dignity should always be defended, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling stories of justice and loyalty. The northern lake looked like a sheet of hammered silver, bright enough to sting the eyes. Morning in Harbor Glen arrived clean and sharp. Pine-scented air, gulls circling above the docks, sunlight slipping between storefronts like it had business to attend. The town wore early summer the way a well-mannered person wore a pressed shirt, not flashy, just quietly proud. At the edge of the square where the brick walkway met the curb, Margaret Whitmore moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had never trusted luck to do the job for her. She was 70, medium height, shoulders still square despite the years. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had faded into soft gray tucked under a faded knit cap even though the day wasn't cold anymore. Fine lines lived around her eyes, not from bitterness but from sunlight and worry and laughter she didn't spend loudly. Her hands were work-worn, the knuckles slightly thickened but careful. Hands that knew how to fold a letter neatly, how to hold a cup without spilling, how to keep going when the world tried to make quitting feel reasonable. She wore a reflective vest over a plain sweatshirt and jeans that had seen too many wash cycles to pretend they were anything but honest. A push broom glided in front of her like a slow tide. She didn't hurry. Margaret believed that rushing was how people broke things, and sometimes how they broke each other. Beside her walked Atlas, a German shepherd, black and tan, his coat dark along the back like a saddle and lighter at the legs and chest. He was older, about 8, maybe 9, his muzzle dusted with the faintest peppering of gray. His ears stood alert but not frantic. His eyes were a deep amber, calm and watchful, as if the world were a puzzle he'd solved once and still respected. Atlas moved with discipline, not the bouncing enthusiasm of a puppy, not the jittery fear of a stray. He walked as if he'd been taught that his body could be a promise. He stayed close, to Margaret's left side, matching her pace exactly. When she stopped, he stopped. When she shifted her grip on the broom, he glanced at her hands like he was checking for pain. People in town knew them. They waved. Margaret nodded back, never dramatic, never needy. Atlas accepted small smiles the way a veteran accepts applause, politely without letting it go to his head. Margaret pushed a crushed paper cup into her dustpan and thought, as she often did, about how a town stayed decent. Not by speeches, not by flags, by small things, by the hands that picked up what others left behind. Atlas's tail swayed once, slow. He paused and sniffed the air. Margaret didn't see anything, but she noticed how his posture changed, chest slightly forward, weight settling into readiness. "Easy," she murmured, not because she feared him, because she trusted him. A low engine growl rolled into the square loud enough to put a thin edge on the morning. A silver SUV swung in too fast. For a place where children sometimes wandered with ice cream and old men crossed with coffee. The vehicle's paint caught the sun like a blade. Atlas's head snapped toward it. Margaret looked up in time to see the SUV's front end drift closer than it should have. She stepped back instinctively, heel catching on a ridge in the brick walkway. The world tilted, a brief, dizzy moment where her body felt like it belonged to someone else. Atlas moved, not with panic, with precision. He stepped between Margaret and the SUV, shoulders squared, stance planted. His bark was sharp, a single clean warning that cut through the gull cries like a whistle. The SUV braked hard, tires chirped, the vehicle stopped with inches to spare. The driver's door opened, out stepped Evan Rourke. He was in his early 30s, tall, lean in a way that suggested gym membership more than labor. His hair was dark blonde, styled carefully as if even the wind should follow his rules. His jaw was clean-shaven and angular, the kind of face that looked good on a billboard. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but his mouth wore a smirk that didn't match the morning. He dressed like money, trying to look casual. Crisp polo, watch too expensive for the town. Sneakers too clean for a place that had real mud. Behind him climbed out two friends, men dressed similarly, laughing as if the near miss had been entertainment. One had a camera phone already up, thumb hovering like it was eager for a story to sell. Evan looked at Margaret's vest and broom like they were props someone had left on set. "Well, look at that," he said, voice pitched for an audience. "The square comes with its own moving obstacles." Margaret steadied her breathing. Her heart had kicked up, but she didn't let it show in her hands. "Sir," she said calmly, "this is a pedestrian area. You need to slow down." Evan's smile widened in a way that wasn't friendly. "I'm filming a promo," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the lake. "The whole point is to show Harbor Glen as, how did they put it, alive. It's hard to make anything look alive when someone's sweeping crumbs into frame." One of the friends laughed. The other panned his camera toward Margaret and Atlas. "Careful," Margaret said, gaze steady. "You nearly hit me." Evan shrugged like it was an inconvenience that she had existed. "And your dog just barked at me," he said. "Does he do that to everyone? Or just people who don't carry a broom?" Atlas didn't growl. He didn't bare teeth. He simply stood, a wall of muscle and patience. Margaret felt the old, familiar heat of indignation rise in her chest. She had swallowed worse than this in life. But she hated above all the kind of cruelty that performed itself. "Atlas," she said quietly. "Heel." He shifted half a step back, still between her and the SUV, obeying her voice like it mattered. Evan's friend, the one filming, leaned closer. "Aw," he cooed. "Look at Grandma's guard dog, cute." Margaret's eyes flicked to the phone. "Don't," she warned, soft as a falling leaf. The warning didn't land. It never did with men who thought consequence was something that happened to other people. Evan gestured at the curbside puddle left from a street cleaning truck earlier that morning. A bucket sat nearby with diluted cleanser, forgotten by another worker. "You know what would make this square really shine?" Evan said, voice sweet with malice. His friend snatched the bucket. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Put that down." The friend didn't. He tipped the bucket forward. The water splashed, cold, gray, and stinging with cleaner. Over Margaret's vest, her sleeves, her cap. It ran down her face and into her collar. The smell of chemicals rose like insult made physical. Atlas took the splash too. Water darkened his coat, ran off his ears, dripped from his whiskers. He blinked once, shocked, not afraid. His body stiffened, a vibration of restraint. Margaret sucked in a breath. For a second she saw a different morning years ago. The way bullies looked when they realized someone had no one standing behind them. But she did have someone. Atlas stepped forward, still no bite, still no lunge, just a deliberate, controlled shift that said enough. Evan's laughter faltered for half a heartbeat, And then, because Evan was the kind of man who treated hesitation like a weakness to be strangled, his pride snapped back. "Sit!" Margaret commanded. Her voice was firmer now, edged with steel she rarely showed. Atlas sat, a perfect sit, like a soldier. Evan scoffed. "Yeah, keep him under control." He kicked the push broom. The handle cracked against the brick and skittered away. The broom head spun, bristles scraping like a small animal trying to escape. Margaret's hands clenched. She could feel how thin her patience had become, thin as ice in spring. Her mind whispered a bitter joke, the kind humor uses to keep grief from choking you. If I swung this broom, I'd be the villain by lunchtime. Instead, she bent slowly, picked up the broken handle and set it beside her dustpan. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of her anger. That decision, quiet, stubborn, was its own kind of rebellion. Atlas watched her hands. His ears flicked back. A low sound rumbled in his chest, the smallest hint of protest. Margaret touched his wet fur briefly, a grounding gesture. "Not today," she murmured, mostly to herself. Evan leaned closer, lowering his voice so it sounded private, conspiratorial, like he was offering her a gift instead of delivering a threat. "You should know," he said. "This project is backed by people who don't like complications." Margaret met his gaze, though she couldn't see his eyes behind the sunglasses. "Complications," she repeated, tasting the word like rust. Evan's smile sharpened. "If he hears about this," Evan said. And then, mid-sentence, he stopped. Not because he'd run out of words, because Atlas did something strange. The dog's head turned sharply toward the road that led down to the lake. Not toward the SUV, not toward Evan's friends, toward the distant stretch where the pines began. Atlas's body went still, as if listening. Not to magic, to something real. A deep, familiar vibration carried through the ground. An engine, low and steady, far off. Margaret felt her skin prickle. She didn't know why. She only knew Atlas's instincts were rarely wrong. Evan noticed the shift, too. He followed Atlas's gaze, annoyed. "What is he staring at?" Evan snapped. Atlas didn't blink. Evan recovered his half-spoken line, but the confidence had chipped. "If he hears about this," Evan finished, "you'll regret it." Margaret's voice came out soft and steady. "Who is he?" Evan's mouth twitched. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, waved to his friends like the scene was over, and climbed into the SUV. The friend with the phone kept recording for another second, then lowered it, suddenly less amused. Evan started the engine. The SUV rolled away, tires whispering over brick, leaving behind damp streaks and a broken broom and the sour smell of cleaner. Margaret stood still until the SUV disappeared beyond the storefronts. Her hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, from the effort of swallowing rage without letting it rot inside her. She looked down at Atlas. Water dripped from his fur, darkening the bricks beneath him like ink. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Atlas rose, stepped closer, and pressed his head against her hip. One firm, grounding nudge. Then, without warning, Atlas moved toward the leash. The old collar, worn leather, softened by time, had a loose catch. Margaret had meant to replace it weeks ago, but kept, putting it off because life had other demands. Atlas hooked the edge of the collar against the broken broom handle on the ground. A quick twist, a practiced motion. The collar slipped free. Margaret's breath caught. "Atlas!" He didn't bolt like a runaway. He looked back at her, amber eyes steady, a question and a promise living in them at the same time. Then Atlas turned and ran, not wildly, purposefully, straight toward the road that led down to the lake where the pine shadows began and the morning light turned thin and sharp. Margaret stood frozen, wet and blinking, holding the leash that was no longer attached to anything. For one strange heartbeat, the square felt too quiet, almost holy, as if something unseen had shifted its weight in the world, and somewhere down that road the low engine vibration hummed again. Closer now. Margaret swallowed, the taste of cleanser still in her mouth, and watched Atlas disappear into the bright distance. She didn't chase him. She simply whispered into the sunlight, half a prayer and half a surrender. Bring him home. The lake had changed its mood by the time Atlas reached it. What had shimmered like silver an hour earlier now lay darker. Stirred by a thin wind moving across its skin, pines stood along the shoreline like silent witnesses, their shadows long and striped across the gravel path. Atlas did not slow down until he reached the old public dock. There, sitting at the very edge with a fishing rod angled over the water, was a man who looked like he had learned long ago how to be still. Calder Whitmore was 40 years old, broad-shouldered but lean, built not like a bodybuilder but like a man who had carried too much weight for too long and learned to make it look effortless. His hair was dark brown, cut short but not military tight, with faint lines at the temples that hinted at both sun and stress. He had a straight nose slightly crooked at the bridge, broken once, never fixed perfectly. His jaw was defined but not theatrical, a shadow of stubble along his chin that suggested he hadn't shaved because he hadn't needed to impress anyone. His eyes were steel gray, steady, the kind that watched first and reacted last. He wore a plain flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves and old jeans faded at the knees. The only detail that betrayed his discipline was the way he held the fishing rod, relaxed but precise. Nothing about him advertised rank, nothing about him begged for recognition. Atlas skidded onto the dock, claws clicking against the wood. Calder didn't jump. He turned his head slowly as if he'd known the dog was coming. "Hey," he said quietly. Atlas stopped 2 feet from him, chest rising hard from the run. Water still clung to his fur. Cleaner scent lingered faintly. Calder's eyes sharpened. He lowered the rod and crouched. "Where's she?" Atlas stepped forward and pressed his muzzle into Calder's chest. Not frantic, not desperate, just firm. Calder rested a hand on the dog's neck. His fingers moved through the damp coat and paused. Cold water, chemical residue. He inhaled once through his nose. "Show me." Atlas turned without hesitation. Calder reeled in the line, secured the rod, and rose. His movements were efficient without looking rushed. He had learned a long time ago that speed without control got people hurt. As they walked back up the path toward the square, Calder's mind ran through quiet calculations. His mother never called him for small things. She believed in handling her own storms. If Atlas had come alone, something had shifted. They reached the edge of the square just as Margaret was gathering the broken broom handle and upright dustpan. She stood straighter when she saw Calder. Not startled. She had known he was in town, though she hadn't told anyone. Her clothes were still damp. Calder stopped a few feet away. "What happened?" Margaret adjusted her cap before answering. It was her tell, buying time. "Nothing worth making noise about." Atlas circled once, and sat beside her again as if confirming that the problem had been delivered. Calder crouched and picked up the broken broom handle. He ran his thumb over the splintered wood. "Did you fall?" "No." "Did anyone touch you?" Margaret met his gaze. "No." He held her eyes a second longer than necessary. He wasn't checking for lies, he was checking for shame. Finding none, his shoulders eased. "A car came in too fast," she said finally, "and a young man with more mouth than sense." Calder glanced toward the storefronts. The morning had resumed its ordinary hum. People walked. A couple of tourists peered into a bakery window. No one stared. "Did they film it?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "Yes." Calder nodded once. He did not curse. He did not ask who. He reached into the truck parked along the curb and pulled out a folded towel, handing it to her. "You should change." "I will." Atlas stood again and looked toward the road where the SUV had vanished earlier. Calder followed that gaze. He felt it now, a thread of something unfinished, like a knot pulled tight but not tied off. A police cruiser rolled into view at the corner. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped out. He was 28, tall and broad but not intimidating, with sandy hair kept short and a face that still held traces of boyish openness. His uniform fit him well, not from vanity but from care. There was a faint scar along his left eyebrow, a reminder of a high school accident that had once made him reckless and later made him careful. Aaron removed his sunglasses when he approached Margaret. "Ma'am?" He didn't salute. He didn't bow. He simply stood straighter. "Deputy?" Margaret replied. Aaron glanced at Calder, recognition flickering. Not surprise, just quiet acknowledgement. "Sir," he said respectfully. Calder nodded back. "Mills." Aaron cleared his throat. "I've reviewed partial footage from the hardware store. Camera. It doesn't show the beginning." Calder's jaw tightened slightly. "Who was driving?" Aaron shifted his weight. "Evan Rourke." The name settled between them like a pebble dropped in still water. Calder knew it. Everyone did. Evan was the face of Harbor Glen's redevelopment push, a project promising boardwalk expansion, boutique hotels, more tourism. He had charm when he wanted it and money when he needed it. Margaret dabbed at her sleeves. "It's done," she said gently. Aaron's mouth twitched. "Ma'am, with respect, it may not be." Calder studied Aaron's face. "Is there more?" he asked. Aaron hesitated, not because he didn't want to answer, but because he wanted to answer correctly. "There's talk," he said carefully, "about the project fast-tracking certain permits. Some of the older properties near the water might not remain as they are." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "This square isn't for sale," Aaron's voice softened. "That's what some people are worried about." A group of teenagers crossed the square, laughing, oblivious to the quiet undercurrent beneath the morning. Calder stood still, absorbing it. He had not come home to fight civic battles. He had come home to breathe. Atlas moved suddenly, not toward the road, toward Aaron. The dog stepped close to the deputy and sniffed his hand. Aaron froze, surprised but not frightened. Atlas sniffed once, twice, then sat beside him. Aaron blinked. "That's new," he murmured. Margaret watched closely. Atlas rarely warmed to strangers without reason. Calder's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, just attentive. Aaron looked down at the dog. "I had a shepherd growing up," he said softly. "Lost him in college. Hit by a truck. I wasn't there." His voice tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out. Calder saw it. The flash of old guilt. Atlas leaned lightly against Aaron's knee. Not dramatic, not needy, just contact. It was a small thing, but it shifted something. Calder glanced at Margaret. She saw it too, that moment, the dog choosing, hung in the air longer than it should have. Atlas stood again, ears forward, and turned his head toward the bakery across the square. Not toward the door, toward the second-floor window above it. Calder followed the line of sight. A curtain moved, just slightly. No face visible, no clear shape, but movement. Calder felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. Atlas gave a low, almost inaudible sound, not a growl, more like recognition. And then he went still again. The curtain stopped moving. The square resumed its innocent rhythm. Calder did not mention it. He only stored it. Aaron exhaled slowly. "I'll file a formal report," he said, "even if it goes nowhere." Calder nodded. "It won't go nowhere." Margaret frowned slightly at him. He softened his tone. "I mean, it shouldn't." Aaron stepped back toward his cruiser. "If you need anything," Margaret smiled gently. "We're fine." Aaron hesitated, then he said something unexpected. "My mother volunteered at the food bank for years," he said. "She used to say a town shows its character in how it treats the people who clean it." Margaret's expression warmed. "Your mother was right." Aaron nodded once more and left. The cruiser rolled away. Silence settled over the square again. Calder bent to pick up the broken broom. "You shouldn't have to deal with this." Margaret adjusted the towel around her shoulders. "I've dealt with worse." Calder met her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "You have." Atlas moved closer between them, pressing his flank against Margaret's leg and brushing Calder's knee, a bridge of fur and bone and breath. Calder looked down at the dog. "You ran all the way to the lake," he murmured. Atlas's tail thumped once against the brick. Margaret studied her son carefully. "You weren't supposed to know," she said. Calder gave a faint smile. "I didn't." He paused. "He told me." Margaret followed his gaze to Atlas. The breeze shifted again, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the scent of pine. Nothing else happened. No confrontation, no shouting. Just a mother, her son, and a dog standing in a square that felt slightly less safe than it had an hour ago. Margaret straightened. "I still have the west side to finish." Calder held out his hand. "Let me." She considered it. Then she shook her head gently. "You can walk with me." Atlas fell into position at her left side again. Calder walked on her right. They moved together across the bricks, sunlight stretching their shadows long behind them. Above the bakery, the curtain did not move again, but Calder did not forget it. He rarely forgot anything. By late afternoon, Harbor Glen had split itself into two quiet camps. One half pretended nothing had happened that morning. Storefronts stayed open, ice cream melted on children's hands. A violinist near the marina played an old Appalachian tune like the town was still innocent. The other half was watching. Not openly, not loudly, but watching. Calder Whitmore walked beside his mother along the western edge of the square where brick gave way to grass and the smell of lake water lingered in the air. Margaret's clothes had dried, but the faint crease in her brow had not. Atlas moved between them like a steady metronome, head level, gate controlled. He had returned to his disciplined rhythm, but there was an alertness to him now. Less curiosity, more assessment. Calder noticed the subtle shift. He also noticed something else. People were greeting Margaret differently. Before there had been casual waves. Now there were longer looks. Questions forming but not spoken. The town had begun to hum with narrative. Calder stopped near the public bulletin board nailed to a wooden post by the marina. Flyers for bake sales. Lost cats. A faded announcement about the Harbor Glen Summer Festival. And there, freshly tacked up, edges sharp, was a glossy rendering of the proposed waterfront redevelopment. Boutique lodging. Glass railings, modern boardwalk extensions. Calder studied the drawing. His expression didn't change, but inside something tightened. Margaret stepped closer. "They've been handing those out since last month," she said quietly. "And you didn't mention it." "You were overseas." Calder didn't respond to that. The word overseas held too many rooms inside it. A familiar voice interrupted. "Commander Whitmore." Calder turned. The woman approaching them was in her early 60s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver blonde hair cut into a precise bob that framed a sharp, thoughtful face. She wore a navy ismti blazer despite the warmth and carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. Her name was Nadine Cross, editor-in-chief of the Harbor Glen Gazette. Her eyes were pale blue, intelligent and direct, but softened by grief that had carved itself into permanent lines around them. Years ago, her son had died in uniform, Marine Corps infantry. She had not become bitter, but she had become careful with power. "I prefer Calder," he replied evenly. Nadine nodded once. "Calder." She glanced at Margaret, offering a respectful smile. "Ma'am." Margaret inclined her head. Nadine held up her phone. "The full footage from this morning has started circulating," she said. "It wasn't posted by the original account." Calder's gaze sharpened. "Where did it come from? That's what I'm trying to determine." Atlas's ears pricked at the tone shift. Nadine continued. "The edited version made you look aggressive," she said carefully. "But the full clip shows otherwise." Margaret's lips pressed thin. "I told you," she murmured to Calder. "It would sort itself out." Calder didn't answer. He studied Nadine instead. "You're planning to print it?" Nadine's chin lifted slightly. "Yes. Why?" The question wasn't hostile. It was measured. Nadine met his eyes without flinching. "Because narrative decides who gets protected," she said, "and I've buried one son already. I won't bury the truth in this town, too." Silence hung there, not heavy but deliberate. Calder gave a single nod. "Then print it." Margaret frowned faintly at him. "Don't escalate this," she said. "I'm not," he replied softly. "I'm correcting it." They began walking again toward the marina. Nadine lingered by the bulletin board, phone in hand, already composing headlines in her mind. Atlas suddenly slowed, his nose lowered toward the grass along the walkway. He inhaled sharply, then followed a scent trail that curved toward the dock's edge. Not frantic, but focused. Calder stopped immediately. "What is it?" Atlas sniffed again, then stepped closer to a metal cleat bolted into the dock. There, nearly invisible against the rust-streaked surface, was a small smear of fresh blue paint. Calder crouched. He rubbed his thumb lightly over it. Wet, recent. Margaret leaned in. "That's not from here." Calder's eyes flicked toward the redevelopment rendering. The proposed boardwalk extension included steel railings painted navy blue. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward the far end of the marina where construction survey stakes had been planted weeks earlier. His posture shifted, not tense, not alarmed, aware. Calder rose slowly. "Have they begun work already?" he asked Margaret. "Officially? No." He studied the lake. A boat idled in the distance near the restricted zone markers. The engine sound was steady, unhurried. Without warning, Atlas stepped onto the narrow edge of the dock and stood completely still. Not barking, not sniffing, just staring across the water toward the boat. Calder followed his line of sight. A man stood at the stern of the vessel, back turned, speaking into a phone. Even from a distance, there was something in the man's posture. Too guarded, too rehearsed. Atlas gave a single low breath, not a growl, a recognition. Calder felt a ripple of memory. He had seen that posture before. Men who controlled outcomes stood like that, not loud, certain. The man ended his call, glanced briefly toward the shore, toward them, and then turned away again. The boat shifted slightly with the current. Calder exhaled slowly. "Stay," he told Atlas. The dog obeyed instantly. The moment passed. The boat remained, nothing overt, but something had drawn a line in the water. Nadine approached again, slower this time. "There's more," she said quietly. Calder turned. "What kind of more?" "Property acquisition notices," she replied. "Several long-time residents near the lake have received buyout letters." Margaret stiffened. "Buyout?" Nadine nodded. Voluntary on paper. Calder's jaw flexed. And if they refuse? Nadine didn't answer directly. She didn't need to. A voice cut through the quiet. Well, this is a picturesque gathering. They turned. Evan Rourke stood at the edge of the marina walkway, sunglasses back on, confidence recalibrated. He wore a linen jacket now, sleeves pushed up in a calculated display of informality. Behind him stood a man older by at least 15 years, mid-40s, broad across the chest, beard neatly trimmed and peppered with gray. This man's suit was darker, more expensive, less concerned with charm. His name was Thomas Kessler. Thomas had the face of someone who had negotiated more than he had celebrated. His eyes were brown and unreadable, his mouth thin but not cruel. Years ago, he had lost a coastal development case in another state when environmental violations surfaced. Since then, he had learned to avoid paper trails. Mr. Whitmore, Thomas said smoothly, I've heard of you. Calder didn't offer his hand. I doubt that. Thomas smiled faintly. Your service record is public, Commander. Margaret inhaled sharply. Calder's gaze hardened. I'm not on duty. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Everything we do is duty to someone. Evan stepped closer. We're trying to improve this town, he said, not fight ghosts. Atlas moved subtly forward. Thomas noticed. Beautiful dog, he said casually. Retired military? Calder didn't blink. Yes. Thomas's smile shifted, almost appreciative. Loyalty, he murmured. Rare trait these days. He glanced toward the water briefly, then back. Construction begins soon. Permits are clean. Nadine's voice cut in, calm but firm. Permits can be challenged. Thomas turned to her. And headlines can be misinterpreted. There it was, the pressure, not loud, precise. Calder stepped forward half a pace. My mother was nearly struck this morning. Evan opened his mouth to dismiss it. Thomas lifted a hand, subtly silencing him. We regret misunderstandings, Thomas said smoothly. But growth requires adjustment. Margaret spoke then. Growth doesn't require humiliation. Thomas met her eyes. For a fraction of a second, something almost like respect flickered there. Then it vanished. Change is inevitable, he said. Calder's voice was steady. Not always. A gull cried overhead. The boat engine in the distance cut off abruptly. The sudden quiet felt deliberate. Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then slipped it back into his pocket without looking at the screen. Enjoy your evening, he said lightly. He and Evan turned and walked back toward the street. Atlas remained standing, watching until they disappeared behind the buildings. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This is getting larger than a splash of water, she murmured. Calder didn't answer immediately. He looked at the lake, at the dock, at the faint smear of blue paint drying on the metal cleat. Lines, he said finally. Margaret glanced at him. Lines? In the water, he replied quietly. You don't always see them, but they're there. Atlas returned to her side, brushing against her leg. The violinist's tune drifted back across the square. Tourists laughed. Sunlight softened. On the surface, Harbor Glen remained charming, but beneath it, currents had begun to move, and Calder Whitmore knew currents well enough to recognize when they were pulling in opposite directions. He placed his hand briefly on Atlas's head. Stay close, he murmured. The dog didn't move. He didn't need to. That evening, the town hall lights burned later than usual. Harbor Glen's municipal building was a modest two-story brick structure that smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and old varnish. The kind of place where decisions were made with more handshakes than contracts, at least in theory. Calder stood outside on the steps, arms folded loosely across his chest, watching residents filter in. He wore a plain dark jacket over a gray Henley, sleeves pushed up. He had shaved since the afternoon, the lines of his jaw sharper now, but his eyes remained the same. Calm, unreadable, alert. Margaret walked beside him, her posture upright despite the long day. She had changed into a clean blouse and cardigan, pale blue, modest but dignified. Her hair was brushed neatly back, silver strands catching the porch light. Atlas walked at her left side again, leash clipped properly this time to a sturdier collar Calder had found in the truck. Inside the hall, folding chairs had been arranged into tight rows. The hum of murmured conversations filled the air, uneasy, curious. At the front of the room stood Councilwoman Diane Mercer, mid-50s, tall and lean with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore rimless glasses and a charcoal suit that made her look sharper than the building deserved. Diane had once been a public defender in the city before moving north after a burnout that left her cynical but not corrupt. She believed in procedure. She believed in paper trails. To her right sat a man with a thick mustache and a permanent squint, flipping through a stack of documents. This was Harold Finch, head of zoning compliance, early 60s, heavy-set, balding, his shirts always one button too tight. He wasn't malicious, just tired. Years of bureaucratic compromise had sanded down his edges. The room quieted when Thomas Kessler entered. He did not rush. He did not wave. He simply moved through the aisle with the composure of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. His dark suit remained immaculate. His beard, trimmed precisely, framed a mouth that rarely revealed full emotion. Evan followed behind, jacket slung casually over his shoulder. Smile recalibrated for public relations. Calder did not react outwardly, but Atlas's head lifted. The dog did not bark. He watched. Diane Mercer tapped the microphone lightly. "Let's begin." The meeting opened with formalities, permits, timelines, community impact assessments. Thomas spoke smoothly about economic revitalization, projected job growth, seasonal tourism increases. His voice was measured, persuasive without raising itself. "Harbor Glen deserves to evolve," he said. "We are not erasing history. We are honoring it by sustaining it." Margaret's lips tightened at the phrasing. Nadine Cross stood in the back row, notepad in hand, observing everything with journalist precision. When public comments opened, the air shifted. An elderly man in the third row rose slowly. His name was Walter Hensley, 73, tall but stooped slightly from decades of working timber. His skin was weathered, his hands thick with calluses. He wore a plaid shirt tucked into worn slacks and spoke with the gravelly voice of someone who had once shouted over chainsaws. "My house sits on the East Ridge," Walter said. "Been there 42 years. Last week I got a letter offering to buy it." Murmurs spread. Thomas leaned back slightly. "It was an optional offer," he replied calmly. "You are under no obligation." Walter cut him off. "The letter said eminent domain could be pursued if negotiations fail." The room stilled. Harold Finch adjusted in his seat uncomfortably. Diane Mercer glanced down at her notes. "That clause is standard language," Thomas said, expression unbroken. "Standard for cities," Walter replied. "Not for us." Atlas shifted closer to Margaret's leg. Calder rose slowly. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood. The movement alone quieted the whispers. "My mother was nearly struck by a vehicle this morning," he said evenly. "That vehicle belonged to a member of your development team." Thomas didn't look surprised. "An unfortunate misunderstanding," he replied. Calder's gaze remained steady. "And this paint." He held up his phone. A photo of the blue smear on the dock cleat filled the screen. That's construction-grade marine enamel, he said, used for permanent steel installations. Thomas's jaw tightened by a fraction. We've conducted preliminary site surveys, he replied. All authorized. Harold Finch cleared his throat. Preliminary marking permits have not been signed off. Silence. At that exact moment, Atlas did something unexpected. He stepped forward, not toward Thomas, not toward Evan, but toward Harold Finch. The heavyset zoning officer froze as the German Shepherd approached. Atlas lowered his nose and sniffed the hem of Harold's pant leg. Once. Twice. Then he sat, right beside him. The gesture wasn't aggressive. It wasn't affectionate. It was pointed. Calder's eyes narrowed slightly. Thomas's expression flickered. Harold shifted uncomfortably. Dog likes you, someone muttered nervously. But Calder saw something else. Atlas had caught the faint scent of that same marine enamel paint on Harold's shoes. The room felt smaller. Diane Mercer leaned forward. Mr. Finch, she said quietly, have you visited the dock area recently? Harold swallowed. Only for routine inspection. When? Yesterday. Calder's voice remained calm. Were contractors present? Harold hesitated. Yes, Thomas interjected smoothly. All standard procedures, without finalized approval. Diane cut in. Thomas's composure thinned. We operate efficiently. Walter Hensley stood, straighter now. Efficient doesn't mean honest. The crowd murmured louder. Atlas remained seated, eyes forward, steady. Harold wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. I was asked to review preliminary structural placement, he admitted. Nothing binding. Diane's jaw tightened. You signed off on dock marking placement? Harold looked at Thomas briefly, then back at Diane. Yes. The admission rippled through the room like a dropped stone in water. Thomas's voice sharpened slightly. The town council authorized early assessments. Assessments, Diane replied, not physical site alteration. Calder stepped forward half a pace. You're moving before the vote. Thomas's eyes met his. Time is money. And trust? Calder asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer. Evan shifted in place, his confidence less fluid now. Nadine scribbled notes rapidly. Margaret watched the scene unfold with a quiet sadness. She had seen men like Thomas before, not in suits but in other uniforms, men who believed momentum justified everything. Diane Mercer stood. This meeting is adjourned pending review of permit compliance. Voices erupted, some angry, some relieved. Thomas gathered his folder slowly. He did not storm out. He approached Calder instead. Commander, he said quietly, close enough that only they could hear. Be careful where you place your lines. Calder held his gaze. I don't place them, he replied. I defend them. Thomas's lips curved faintly. We'll see. He turned and exited, Evan trailing behind. Harold Finch remained seated for a moment longer, shoulders slumped. Atlas rose only when Calder touched his collar lightly. Outside, the evening air had cooled. Streetlights flickered on. Margaret exhaled. This won't end here, she said softly. No, Calder agreed. Walter Hensley approached them near the steps. He removed his cap respectfully. Thank you, he said gruffly. Calder shook his hand firmly. You stood up first. Walter nodded. I've cut timber my whole life, he said. You learn to hear when a tree's about to fall. He glanced at Atlas. Dog heard it too. Atlas's tail moved once. Nadine joined them. The Gazette goes to print in the morning, she said. Calder met her eyes. Stick to facts. I always do. Margaret looked at her son. Don't let anger lead this. He gave a small nod. It won't. They began walking home under the amber glow of streetlights. Atlas walked slightly ahead now, not pulling, just scanning. The lake lay dark and quiet to their left, somewhere out there. Unseen, currents shifted beneath the surface. Calder glanced once more toward the marina. The paint would dry overnight, but so would resolve. He rested his hand briefly on Atlas's back. "Good work," he murmured. The dog did not look up. He simply continued forward, steady and silent. Night settled over Harbor Glen with a deceptive softness. The town had quieted after the council meeting, but quiet did not mean calm. It meant people were thinking. Lights burned later than usual in kitchen windows. Phones buzzed, screens glowed. Calder walked home with Margaret along Maple Street, Atlas pacing slightly ahead, his silhouette steady against the amber pools of streetlight. Margaret's house sat on a modest rise overlooking a narrow stretch of shoreline. White siding, dark shutters, a front porch that had held more conversations than arguments. The kind of house that carried history without boasting about it. Calder unlocked the door and stepped inside first, out of habit rather than fear. The interior smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and old books. Framed photographs lined the hallway, Calder in uniform, younger and less lined, Margaret standing beside him, pride restrained but unmistakable. Atlas moved through the rooms methodically, nose low, tail neutral. He had learned this routine years ago. Enter, sweep, confirm. He paused briefly at the back door, then continued. Everything appeared undisturbed. Margaret set her purse down on the kitchen counter and exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know," Calder replied. That answer held more weight than the words themselves. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, gaze drifting toward the dark window above the sink. "I've seen men like Kessler," he said quietly. They don't lose in public." Margaret poured herself a glass of water. "And you don't escalate in private." A faint smile tugged at Calder's mouth. "No." Atlas lay down near the kitchen doorway, but his ears remained alert. The phone rang. The sudden sound cut through the room. Margaret glanced at the caller ID. Unknown number. She hesitated. Calder stepped closer. "Let it go to voicemail." She did. The ringing stopped. Silence. Returned. Thicker now. Moments later, her phone chimed with a voicemail notification. Margaret didn't move to check it. Instead, she sat at the small wooden kitchen table and folded her hands. Calder watched her. "You want me to listen to it?" he asked. She nodded once. He pressed play. The message contained no voice, just background noise. Wind, a faint mechanical hum, and then a dog barking. Not Atlas, a different bark, higher pitched, anxious. The recording cut off abruptly. Margaret's face drained of color. "That's Mrs. Talbot's dog," she whispered. Calder's eyes sharpened. Mrs. Eleanor Talbot was 78, widowed, slight, and bird-like in build. She wore her white hair in a loose bun and walked with a cane carved by her late husband. Her small terrier Daisy was her constant companion, a scruffy tan mix with one ear permanently bent and a bark far larger than her body. Margaret rose. "That came from near her place," Calder grabbed his jacket without hesitation. Atlas was already standing. They stepped back into the night. The air had cooled further, the scent of lake water stronger now. Mrs. Talbot's house sat 3 blocks down, closer to the waterline than Margaret's. A single porch light burned dimly. As they approached, Atlas slowed. His nose lifted, his body changed. No tension, but intent. The gate to Mrs. Talbot's small yard hung slightly ajar. Calder felt his pulse shift into a familiar rhythm. He stepped forward first. "Mrs. Talbot?" Margaret called softly. No answer. Atlas moved toward the side of the house, paused silent on the grass. Calder followed. Behind the shed, near the narrow path that led toward the shoreline, lay a torn stack of papers scattered across the ground. Margaret picked one up. Her hands trembled. They were property acquisition notices, stamped, signed, and ripped in half. A faint whimper came from behind the shed. Daisy, the small terrier, emerged, trembling but unhurt, leash dragging behind her. Margaret scooped her up instinctively. "Where is she?" she whispered. Calder scanned the dark shoreline, then he saw it. Down near the water's edge, a figure sat on an overturned bucket. Mrs. Talbot. Atlas reached her first. He approached slowly, lowered his head, and pressed gently against her knee. She didn't startle. She simply looked down at him, tears reflecting porch light from a distance. "They came back," she said hoarsely as Calder and Margaret approached. Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone who had been bracing for something and finally met it. "Who?" Calder asked. "Two men," she replied. "Not the young one, different ones." Margaret knelt beside her. What did they want? Mrs. Talbot's hand shook slightly as she gestured toward the torn papers. "They said the offer expires tomorrow, that if I refuse, they'll proceed anyway." Her thin shoulders trembled. "I told them this house is all I have left of Harold." Harold, her husband of 53 years. Calder crouched to her level. "Did they threaten you?" She hesitated. "They said accidents happen when docks get busy." The wind shifted. Atlas's ears flicked sharply toward the tree line. Without warning, Atlas stood completely still, not growling, not barking, still. His head turned slightly toward the narrow path leading into the pines. Calder followed the direction instantly. There, a faint red glow, not bright enough to be a flashlight, just the brief blink of a cigarette ember. Someone was standing in the shadows, watching. The ember disappeared. Footsteps, soft, retreating, crunched against gravel. Calder didn't chase. He memorized the sound. Atlas took one step forward. Calder's hand lowered gently to his collar. "Not yet." The moment dissolved into the darkness. Mrs. Talbot clutched Daisy tighter. "I thought they were gone." Calder's voice remained calm. "They are, for now." Margaret's jaw tightened. "This isn't just permits anymore." Calder nodded once. "No." He helped Mrs. Talbot to her feet. "You're staying with us tonight," Margaret said firmly. Mrs. Talbot started to protest. Margaret didn't allow it. "I won't argue." They walked back together, Daisy cradled in Margaret's arms, Atlas pacing slightly behind now, watching the edges of the street. Inside Margaret's kitchen, Mrs. Talbot sat at the table wrapped in a blanket. Daisy trembled in her lap. Calder stood by the window scanning the dark outside. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. Men like Thomas didn't need to issue threats personally. They applied pressure. Others executed. Margaret poured tea for Mrs. Talbot. "We will not be pushed," she said softly. Mrs. Talbot wiped her eyes. "I've lived here longer than any of them," she whispered. "How can paper erase that?" Calder stepped closer. "It can't." Atlas moved to lie beside Mrs. Talbot's chair. The small terrier eventually stopped trembling. Hours passed. The house settled. Wind tapped gently at the siding. Calder remained awake long after the others slept. He stepped onto the porch alone, Atlas following. The lake lay dark and unreadable. He leaned against the railing, hands gripping the wood. "I've seen intimidation before," he murmured. Atlas sat beside him. Calder glanced down. "I don't want this to become something it shouldn't." Atlas's amber eyes reflected the faint porch light. Steady, unblinking. Calder exhaled. "We'll hold the line." Inside, Margaret watched from the hallway, not because she doubted him, but because she understood the weight he carried. The town slept, but Harbor Glen was no longer innocent. Somewhere in the dark, currents moved beneath still water, and some things once stirred did not settle easily. Morning did not arrive gently. It came sharp and colorless, the kind of pale northern light that showed every imperfection. Harbor Glen looked the same from a distance. Quiet streets, gulls skimming the lake, bakery smoke curling upward, but the air felt tighter, as if the town itself had taken a shallow breath and forgotten to release it. Calder had slept in fragments. Atlas had not slept at all. The German shepherd lay near the front door through the night, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but aware. Every engine that passed, every shift of wind, every distant footstep registered in the subtle flick of his ears. When dawn bled into the kitchen window, Calder was already awake, standing at the counter with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hand. Margaret moved more slowly that morning. She had insisted Mrs. Talbot stay in the guest room, and Daisy had finally quieted around 2 in the morning, curled into Atlas's flank like a nervous child seeking shelter. Calder stepped onto the porch to check the perimeter out of habit rather than paranoia. He froze. The wooden railing bore a thin scratch across its surface, fresh, shallow, but deliberate. On the mailbox at the end of the walkway, a black X had been sprayed across the metal. Not large, not artistic, precise. Calder did not swear. He crouched and examined the paint, industrial-grade marker, oil-based, not a teenager's vandalism, intentional. Margaret stepped onto the porch behind him and saw it instantly. Her face hardened. This is escalation. Calder rose slowly. It's intimidation. Atlas stepped outside, nose immediately lowering toward the mailbox. He sniffed once, twice. Then he turned, not toward the road, not toward the water, but toward the neighboring house. The house belonged to Mr. Leon Carver, a retired electrician in his late 60s. Leon was tall, thin as a fence post, with white hair that stuck out stubbornly and wire-framed glasses that slid down his nose when he worked. He was a widower, quiet but observant, and had lived beside Margaret for nearly 30 years. Atlas walked straight to Leon's driveway. Calder followed. Leon stood outside, staring at his own mailbox. It too bore the same black X. He looked up when Calder approached. "They hit you too?" Leon asked quietly. Calder nodded once. Leon adjusted his glasses. "They came around 3 in the morning. I heard tires." "Did you see faces?" Calder asked. Leon shook his head. Windows tinted. Margaret stepped closer. "This won't scare us." Leon gave a faint, tired smile. "They're not trying to scare you," he said. "They're trying to measure you." Calder absorbed that. Atlas sniffed around Leon's driveway, then stopped near the curb. There, faint tire impressions in the gravel shoulder. Calder crouched. Truck. Heavy suspension. Wide tread, not a standard SUV. He memorized the pattern inside the house. Mrs. Talbot stood at the window, clutching her teacup. When she saw the black X on the mailbox, her shoulders sagged. "They marked me too," she whispered. Margaret walked back inside to reassure her. Calder stayed outside. The street remained quiet, but word traveled quickly. Within an hour, 2 more houses reported similar markings, properties that had received acquisition letters. Harbor Glen was being mapped, not by survey stakes, by pressure. Deputy Aaron Mills arrived mid-morning. His uniform was crisp, but the dark circles under his eyes suggested he had not slept well either. He crouched beside the mailbox and ran a gloved finger along the paint. "Same stencil," he said. "Same marker." Calder crossed his arms. "Security cameras? Most of these homes don't have them," Aaron replied. "Yours?" Calder shook his head. Aaron exhaled slowly. I can increase patrol frequency, but if they're smart, they'll rotate vehicles. They're not random, Calder said evenly. They're strategic. Aaron met his gaze. You think Kessler is ordering this? I think men like him don't need to. Aaron stood. I'll document everything. As he walked back toward his cruiser, Atlas suddenly stopped mid-step. His ears pricked forward sharply, not toward the road, toward the roofline. Calder followed the dog's gaze. On the utility pole across the street, something small had been affixed just beneath the transformer box. Atlas let out a low, contained rumble, not aggressive, not fearful, focused. Calder stepped closer. Mounted to the pole was a small black device, no larger than a deck of cards, a camera, camouflaged, facing directly toward Margaret's house, not municipal, private. Calder's pulse slowed instead of quickened. Control through observation. He signaled quietly to Aaron. The deputy's jaw tightened when he saw it. That's not authorized, Aaron's muttered. Calder's voice remained level. They're watching reactions. Aaron carefully photographed the device before removing it. His expression had changed now, less polite, more resolved. I'll run the serial, he said. If it's tied to a private contractor, we have probable cause. Margaret stepped back outside. Her eyes moved from the mailbox to the camera in Aaron's hand. She didn't look afraid. She looked disappointed. They think we're livestock, she said quietly, to be tagged and counted. Calder turned toward her. We're not. Inside the house, Daisy barked suddenly. A sharp, frantic sound. Atlas pivoted and rushed in. Calder followed. In the kitchen, Daisy stood rigid near the back door, fur bristled. Atlas moved to her side, nose low. The back door latch had been tampered with. The wood around it bore faint scratch marks, not from an animal, from a tool. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. They tried the door. Calder's expression hardened. They wanted entry. Mrs. Talbot sank into a chair. Harold used to say, she whispered, when someone tests your door, they're deciding whether to come back. Atlas sniffed the door frame, then lifted his head sharply. He stepped back, and then, unexpectedly, he lay down directly in front of the door, blocking it. Not pacing, not whining, guarding. Calder felt a strange calm settle over him. He had been in hostile villages before, where men marked homes and tested boundaries before making demands. This felt familiar, but this wasn't overseas. This was his mother's porch. He stood and reached for his phone. He dialed a number he had not used in months. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, low, steady, precise. Dr. Evelyn Harper. Dr. Evelyn Harper was 42, tall and athletic with sharp cheekbones and dark brown hair usually pulled into a practical ponytail. She had been a veterinary, behaviorist attached to a military working dog program overseas. Her specialty was not healing wounds but reading stress patterns in trained animals. She understood that dogs perceived shifts humans missed. Evelyn, Calder said, I need your perspective. Within an hour, she arrived in a dark pickup truck. Her eyes scanned the house, the mailbox, the utility pole. Then she knelt beside Atlas. She didn't pet him immediately. She watched. Atlas watched back. He's not anxious, she said quietly. He's vigilant. Calder nodded. He's not reacting emotionally, she continued. He's assessing threat vectors. Margaret frowned slightly at the terminology. Evelyn softened her tone. He doesn't feel chaos, she said gently. He feels pattern. Calder understood. Evelyn stood. Whoever did this wanted you to see it, and they wanted him to sense it. Calder's jaw tightened. They miscalculated. Evelyn glanced at Atlas. Maybe. Outside, a truck engine passed slowly down the street, not stopping, just passing, but slower than traffic should. Atlas's ears flicked. He did not bark, he did not chase, he simply watched until the vehicle turned the corner. Evelyn exhaled. "They're probing," she said. Margaret folded her arms. "They won't find weakness." Calder stepped onto the porch again. The lake shimmered in the distance, deceptively peaceful under the rising sun. The black X still marked the mailbox, the scratch still marked the railing. But something else had shifted. They were no longer reacting. They were observing back. Calder rested his hand on Atlas's neck. "Morning," he murmured softly. The dog leaned slightly into his touch, not for reassurance, for alignment. Inside, Mrs. Talbot began making coffee as if it were any other day. Leon Carver replaced his mailbox flag, hands steady. Deputy Mills drove slowly past, not casually. The town was awake now, not panicked, aware. And awareness was heavier than fear. Calder looked once more at the horizon. "They wanted to test us," he said quietly. Margaret stood beside him. "And?" He met her eyes. "They won't like the results." Atlas remained still at the threshold, guarding the door, watching the street, waiting. The morning after the black X's appeared, Harbor Glen did not whisper. It gathered. By 9 o'clock, the narrow stretch of shoreline near the public dock had begun to fill. Not with tourists, not with contractors, but with residents. Not loud, not angry, present. Calder stood at the edge of the sand, boots planted firmly where grass met gravel. He wore a dark flannel again, sleeves rolled to the forearm, hands steady at his sides. He had not shaved that morning. His jaw carried the faint shadow of fatigue, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in days. Margaret stood beside him, posture upright despite her years. She wore her light blue cardigan again, the one she chose when she wanted to look composed but not confrontational. Daisy rested in her arms, calmer now, though her small ears twitched at unfamiliar sounds. Atlas stood slightly forward, not on command but by instinct. His body was aligned with the crowd, not facing them but facing outward toward the waterline and the narrow strip of access road that curved behind the trees. He was not tense. He was ready. Walter Hensley arrived first among the older residents, cap in hand, boots dusty from his walk. Behind him came Leon Carver, glasses pushed higher than usual on his nose, jaw set. Nadine Cross arrived next, camera slung across her shoulder instead of just her phone. She wore a windbreaker and jeans, practical, purposeful. Her expression held the quiet resolve of someone who had chosen her side. Deputy Aaron Mills parked his cruiser a short distance away, not blocking, not imposing, just visible. And then others came. 15, 20, 30 families, shop owners, retirees. Some had black X's on their mailboxes, some did not, but they had all seen them. Calder had not called for this. He had not organized it, but word had traveled through quiet kitchens and back fences. People were done pretending not to see. A truck engine rumbled from beyond the tree, not a slow pass, a steady approach. Atlas's ears shifted first, his head lifted slightly. Calder did not move. The truck emerged into view. A white, heavy-duty pickup, raised suspension, wide tires. The same tread pattern Calder had memorized in the gravel the night before. The vehicle slowed as it approached the shoreline lot. Inside were two men. One drove. Thick forearms, shaved head, mirrored sunglasses. The passenger door opened before the truck fully stopped. Out stepped Marcus Delaney. Marcus was late 30s, tall and powerfully built, with close-cropped black hair and a trimmed beard that gave his face a sculpted severity. His eyes were dark, assessing. He wore a fitted jacket despite the warming sun and moved with the loose confidence of someone accustomed to enforcing instructions rather than making them. Calder recognized the type immediately. Not executive, operational. Marcus scanned the gathering crowd. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He simply calculated. "This is private access," Marcus called out evenly. His voice carried without strain. "We're conducting preliminary site measurement." Walter stepped forward half a pace. "This is public shoreline." Marcus's gaze shifted. Not for long. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Margaret's hand tightened slightly around Daisy. Calder finally moved. He stepped forward into the open space between Marcus and the townspeople. No aggressive posture, just presence. "You've already conducted unauthorized markings," Calder said calmly. "Now you're bringing equipment." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You're the one causing delays. I'm the one asking for compliance." Marcus's jaw flexed once. Behind him, the second man in the truck revved the engine lightly. Atlas stepped forward, not lunging, not barking, just shifting to align himself beside Calder's left leg. His amber eyes never left Marcus. Re-hook moment. And then Atlas did something none of them expected. He sat, not in retreat, not in submission, in front of Calder, directly in the narrow path between Marcus and the shoreline. A deliberate block. The gesture carried no teeth, no noise, only message. Marcus's gaze dropped briefly to the dog. For the first time, a faint flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He recognized discipline when he saw it. "You're using a dog to intimidate?" Marcus asked coolly. Calder's voice remained level. "I'm using restraint." The crowd grew quieter. Even the gulls seemed to pause. Marcus looked past Calder toward the group behind him. "Last chance," he said evenly. "We have legal authority." Deputy Mills stepped forward then, not aggressively but decisively. "Show it." Marcus's lips pressed thin. "Permit documentation is on file." "With the council under review," Mills replied. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You think this town can afford to block this project?" Margaret answered from behind Calder. "We can't afford not to." The second man in the truck opened his door halfway as if preparing to step out, but he didn't. Marcus held up a hand subtly, signaling him to stay. He studied the crowd again. This was not a small protest. This was not two people and a dog. This was visibility, and visibility complicated leverage. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You're making this difficult." Calder didn't blink. "No," he said quietly. "You are." A long pause followed. The lake water lapped gently at the shoreline. Atlas remained seated, unmoving. Marcus looked at the dog again. "Impressive training," he muttered. Calder's tone softened slightly. "He protects what matters." Marcus studied him one last time. Then he stepped back toward the truck. "We'll return with paperwork," he said evenly. The engine growled louder as the vehicle reversed slowly. No sudden acceleration. No dramatics. Just retreat. The truck turned and disappeared back along the tree-lined road. No one cheered. No one clapped. They simply stood, holding ground. Calder turned to face the townspeople. "This isn't over," he said. "It may get worse before it settles." Walter nodded. "We've weathered worse." Leon Carver adjusted his glasses. "They thought we'd fold." Margaret looked at her son. "They thought we were alone." Nadine stepped closer, camera lowered now. "This," she said quietly, gesturing to the gathered residents, "is the headline." Calder shook his head faintly. "Stick to the permits." She gave him a knowing look. "Stories matter." Atlas finally stood. He turned his head toward the water briefly, then back toward Calder. His breathing was steady. Calder crouched slightly and ran a hand along the dog's back. "Good work." Atlas leaned subtly into the touch. Behind them, Mrs. Talbot stepped forward shakily. "I won't sell," she said. "Not like this." Others murmured agreement. Deputy Mills approached Calder quietly. "They'll regroup," he said. "I know. But now it's public." Calder nodded once. "That's the difference." The crowd slowly began to disperse, not in defeat, in solidarity. Small clusters of neighbors walked back up the path together, voices low but steady. Margaret lingered by the water's edge. The sunlight had strengthened now, reflecting sharply off the lake. She watched it for a moment before speaking. "I didn't raise you for this." Calder smiled faintly. "You raised me to stand." She looked at Atlas. "And him?" Calder's gaze softened. "He chose." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we'll all choose." Atlas stepped slightly ahead again, scanning the path as they began walking home. Not because he feared the truck's return, but because vigilance had become part of their rhythm. Harbor Glen was no longer divided into whispers. It had shown its weight, and for the first time since the Black X appeared, the air felt different, not lighter, but balanced. Calder glanced once over his shoulder toward the empty access road. He knew men like Marcus did not surrender easily. But he also knew something else. Force faltered in the face of witnesses. Atlas walked beside him, steady, aligned, and the shoreline remained unbroken. In Harbor Glen, nothing exploded. No dramatic arrests, no blazing headlines that shook the nation. What happened was quieter than that, and yet it mattered. A mother stood her ground. A son chose restraint over rage. A town chose unity over fear. And a dog, loyal, watchful, disciplined, reminded everyone that sometimes protection does not roar. It simply remains. The greatest miracles rarely arrive in thunder. They arrive in alignment. They arrive when ordinary people refuse to bend toward injustice. They arrive when courage is steady instead of loud. They arrive when someone decides, not here, not like this. Many people wait for God to intervene with spectacle, but more often his work moves through willing hearts, through a neighbor who steps forward, through a deputy who chooses integrity, through a journalist who prints the truth, through a son who stands calmly in front of his mother, and sometimes through a dog who senses what others ignore. Atlas did not perform a supernatural act. He simply stayed alert. He responded with discipline. He guarded what mattered. And that in itself feels like a quiet miracle. Because loyalty in a world of pressure is rare. The lesson is simple and powerful. You do not need to be the loudest voice in the room to change its direction. You do not need anger to protect what is right. You do not need power to stand firm. You need conviction. In daily life, we are all faced with moments where something small feels wrong. A lie, a shortcut, a quiet intimidation, a subtle pressure to look away. Most people walk past. But every so often, someone stands. And when they stand, others remember they can too. That is how communities are preserved. That is how dignity survives. That is how light pushes back darkness, not by shouting, but by remaining present. If this story moved you, ask yourself, where in your life are you being called to stand? Where can you choose integrity instead of comfort? Where can you be steady instead of reactive? Maybe your battle isn't a shoreline. Maybe it's your workplace, your family, your faith, your values, but the principle is the same. Hold the line. Trust that God sees what happens in the quiet. Trust that justice does not always arrive instantly, but it arrives through people who refuse to surrender their conscience. And trust that even in moments that feel intimidating or uncertain, you are not standing alone. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs encouragement to stay strong. Leave a comment about what you would have done in Calder's place. Your voice might strengthen someone else. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this matter. Stories about courage without noise, faith without spectacle, and loyalty that does not break under pressure. And may God bless you and your home. May He give you steadiness when the world tests you. May He surround you with people and even animals who stand beside you in truth. And may he grant you the courage to protect what matters most. In Harbor Glen, nothing exploded. No dramatic arrests, no blazing headlines that shook the nation. What happened was quieter than that, and yet it mattered. A mother stood her ground. A son chose restraint over rage. A town chose unity over fear. And a dog, loyal, watchful, disciplined, reminded everyone that sometimes protection does not roar. It simply remains. The greatest miracles rarely arrive in thunder. They arrive in alignment. They arrive when ordinary people refuse to bend toward injustice. They arrive when courage is steady instead of loud. They arrive when someone decides, not here, not like this. Many people wait for God to intervene with spectacle, but more often his work moves through willing hearts, through a neighbor who steps forward, through a deputy who chooses integrity, through a journalist who prints the truth, through a son who stands calmly in front of his mother, and sometimes through a dog who senses what others ignore. Atlas did not perform a supernatural act. He simply stayed alert. He responded with discipline. He guarded what mattered, and that in itself feels like a quiet miracle. Because loyalty in a world of pressure is rare. The lesson is simple and powerful. You do not need to be the loudest voice in the room to change its direction. You do not need anger to protect what is right. You do not need power to stand firm. You need conviction. In daily life, we are all faced with moments where something small feels wrong. A lie, a shortcut, a quiet intimidation, a subtle pressure to look away. Most people walk past. But every so often, someone stands. And when they stand, others remember they can too. That is how communities are preserved. That is how dignity survives. That is how light pushes back darkness, not by shouting, but by remaining present. If this story moved you, ask yourself, where in your life are you being called to stand? Where can you choose integrity instead of comfort? Where can you be steady instead of reactive? Maybe your battle isn't a shoreline. Maybe it's your workplace, your family, your faith, your values. But the principle is the same. Hold the line. Trust that God sees what happens in the quiet. Trust that justice does not always arrive instantly, but it arrives through people who refuse to surrender their conscience. And trust that even in moments that feel intimidating or uncertain, you are not standing alone. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs encouragement to stay strong. Leave a comment about what you would have done in Calder's place. Your voice might strengthen someone else. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this matter. Stories about courage without noise, faith without spectacle, and loyalty that does not break under pressure. And may God bless you and your home. May he give you steadiness when the world tests you. May he surround you with people, and even animals, who stand beside you in truth. And may he grant you the courage to protect what matters most.